I've watched the Shake Shack issue. I've never been to a Shake Shack. I'm aware of its existence, but I've never been. My first real experience with Shake Shack is, if I'm being honest, the New York Times piece. Well, that's not true, but whatever. The New York Times piece is probably the, I guess you could say, first announcement outside of the one that I think I've been passed or something along my travels. But nevertheless, this particular Shake Shack, infamous Shake Shack. Why is this Shake Shack infamous? Because supposedly there's a conspiracy theory out there that cops were poisoned. Now, I watched this as it happened. I didn't do this story, but it evolved. And initially it was nothing to see here, folks. Then it was cops poison. And then it kind of trailed off. You realize that they did that on purpose. Let me repeat that. When they looked into the Shake Shack, and I'm going to give you the timeline, the top brass of the New York Police Department escalated the story without anything around it. And I would make the point that they escalated it in order to change the narrative because they thought cops were under siege, and they wanted to make this argument that all of these protesters are out here going after cops. This badge is not tarnished. And so they inserted a story of cops under siege using basically a bogus claim at a Shake Shack, something that basically never took place. I'm going to give you the story. It is utterly outrageous. And what I mean by outrageous, they must be investigated. And the person who's responsible for this needs to be prosecuted. The notion that the police department is going to intentionally implant a story into the public that has no value or validity to it at all, entirely, for what I strongly suspect is to change the narrative that was taking place of the public, showing cops abusing the public with their cell phone cameras and social media and whatnot. Well, not to mention mainstream media. I mean, the New York Times was running posts basically saying that the violence was coming from the cops themselves. They wanted to change the narrative. We're under siege. We're under attack. That's what they wanted to get across. That all of you out here protesting, we're under siege. We're the blue line, and you guys are, all right, our jobs are so dangerous. Look at this. Somebody tried to poison us. Nobody tried to poison you. And worse than that, you conjured up that story out of whole cloth. That is not your job. And if there is any law on the books that is broken, this needs to be probed and then needs to be prosecuted. That is outrageous. We cannot have our police stations out here fabricating and falsely putting out stories for the exact sole point of basically changing whatever prevailing narrative there is out there in the public. It is not their job. It is not their responsibility to do such. And while they might do so on some level, this is way above board. There was no value or validity to the story. And they still put the story out there as if it was true. Welcome to the soapbox. My name is Jamal Thomas. This is the Progressive Soapbox. Guys, if you dig this content, please like, share, and subscribe. You can always support this content through PayPal or Patreon. I'm not going to keep this video long, but this annoyed the hell out of me. Because I remember when this was taking place, you had all of these protests going on. You had people, or the cops, I would imagine, they thought they were besieged. These agents of the state, the poor, paid to bash and abuse the other poor, and having themselves videotaped over and over and over again, doing what they basically do on a daily basis, and the public no longer accepting this myth that they were fair and unbiased and honest in regards to the way they dealt with blacks. The public now disagrees. They know the public disagrees. They know the public considers they deal inequitably with African Americans, for that matter, Hispanics, or basically people of color. They're besieged in their heads. Not physically, but from the standpoint of a narrative that changed almost immediately with the murder of Floyd. So what do you do if you're besieged? What do you do if you're sick of this narrative, this drumbeat, the media constantly talking about the protests, those protests specific to this notion of defund the police, which represents people like you, your $6 billion budget? What do you do? What do you do? Everybody is talking about you. Everybody is talking about you. All of these words that are being thrown. People are yelling and throwing shit at you. They're throwing apples at you. And they're throwing empty cans. They're angry at you because they saw you murder a man. And every last murder, the 1,000 that took place year after year after year after year, with 99% of you walking, all came to fruition at once. Righteous indignation of the public. You believe you get away with your murders. There are consequences. Those consequences they don't have to happen in the moment, but they are indeed consequences. That deficit that gets built up, that deficit of justice, if you want to call it, that gets built up over time. Each killing that takes place, each killing where you had a rational action that you could have taken beyond the fact of taking that man's life. Every time you punch, beat, abuse, kick, break the teeth out of, like you did to somebody at a protest the other day. Every time you flagrantly steal something in civil asset forfeiture, every time you abuse somebody's rights, it makes and legitimizes these protests. You hate those protests because those protests show a mirror into all of the things that you've done over time that have created those people in that result out there screaming at you in that moment. You want to change the narrative. And you want to make the aggrieved Petey Saw case that you are under assault and your officers are somehow poisoned and it's such a hard job. So what do? You have officers who call somewhere to get a shake. They go pick up their shake. Now keep in mind, this was sent by like a text messenger or by app. So they didn't know that the people who were ordering this were cops. Those cops go, they pick up their shake. They taste it. It tastes funny. They toss it. They tell the manager. The manager apologizes and gives them a credit. That's what happened. That's it. It should have stopped there. Top brass hears about the story. And they tell them, go get emergency services. And immediately escalate what was nothing. This is New York Post. And it says, right here. So right here. But when the cops told their sergeant about the incident, the supervisor called an emergency service unit to set up a crime scene at the fast food joint for an evidence search around 9:20 p.m., 2 hours after they first got the sour shakes. Nothing happened, and they immediately called in a crime scene investigation unit. All right, it gets worse. The three were rushed to Bellevue Hospital, where they were examined and released without ever showing a symptom of anything. Nothing happened. Immediately rushed to Bellevue Hospital. They had no symptoms. No crime had been committed. They immediately called the crime scene place. All right. Meanwhile, the lieutenant from the Bronx blasted out an email to the unions that 6 cops were throwing up after drinking beverages they got from Shake Shack on 200 Broadway. They weren't 6 cops. There were only 3. They weren't throwing up. They weren't doing anything. They were rushed to Bellevue Hospital because they were forced to go to Bellevue Hospital. None of that was true. This is what they're putting out, lying to the public. None of that was true. Detectives easily closed the case after interviewing the employees and reviewing the surveillance footage of the shakes were made normally. What was going on was that basically the person had cleaned it and made the shakes immediately after. So there wasn't enough time for the cleaning solution to basically either evaporate or they didn't clean it enough to get the cleaning solution off of the materials. That's all that happened. When they made the shakes, it had like a taste to it. Nobody was poisoned. There wasn't an assassination attempt. They weren't under an attack. It weren't 6 officers. Nobody was throwing up. None of that happened. So right here. Right. At 10:45 p.m., the Detectives Endowment Association was declaring the finest had become ill after being intentionally poisoned by one of the workers at Shake Shack. None of that was true. This is them conjuring up a narrative to make it look as if their officers are being aggrieved by these hostile people out there who are now poisoning us. They're trying to taint the image of the protesters because their image have been so tainted that this is the only thing they got in order to try to make these people look bad. You're so pathetic. You're so pathetic. Everything that you do on this justifies the existence of those people being out there. Your budget is way too high. If you can put out shit like this, you have way too much time on your hands and your budget is exceedingly too high. I'm not saying get rid of you, at least not yet. But I am saying your budget is far too extravagant. If you have the resources to waste time basically putting out something that basically wasn't true in the least. And yes, you should be investigated to make sure there wasn't any malfeasance here between all of the lying that took place. Not to mention, if you lie this much in regards to your interactions with the public, or if you're this comically incompetent, then how can we expect you to actually do your jobs? How? If you get this wrong, this was internal to your organization. If you can't even get that right, how do we expect you to deal with the various cases to which you deal with on a daily basis? How? This is not even something where you have to go and investigate. Internal. Either you are intentionally lying, in which case somebody should be prosecuted, or you're comically stupid, in which case somebody should be fired. Choose. Pick one. But one of those things needs to take place. And if that doesn't take place, something flagrantly problematic is going wrong in the way that institution is organizing itself in its checks and balances in regards to the way people behave. Amazing. A Police Benevolent Association president, Pat Lynch, made a show of visiting Bellevue while the union declared at 10:47 p.m. that the police officers came under attack, quote unquote, from a toxic substance believed to be bleach. Around 3 a.m. June 16th, the department was reviewing a statement on the matter at 4 a.m., just over 8 hours after the cops picked up the Sheiks. Chief of Detective Rodney Harrison announced Twitter there was no criminality. The unions later deleted the tweets and issued statements walking back the discredited claims. Privately, they blamed the lieutenant who first raised the alarm. Even though the lieutenant raised the alarm, who put it up to 6? Who blasted out that they were vomiting? That never happened. Who blasted out that they were ill? Who blasted out that you were under attack? You all did that. You may want to blame the lieutenant to be the inciting factor, but let's just be very clear. You all did that. One of you flagrantly lied. And in flagrantly lying, gave the public a misperception of events that I would strongly argue was to basically make a perspective out there that you were somehow being under assault and being poisoned by all of the protesters or people who are sympathetic to the protesters. That is despicable. And you use Shake Shack to do that, who should sue the living shit out of you for damages and defamation, especially when there was no honest belief that this ever happened. Shake Shack, I hope you have lawyers. Sue away. Like, share,